Okay, so good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Electoral Politics in the Empire State. My name is Michael Armato. I'm the secretary of the New York State Political Science Association, and I teach at Albright College. Thank you all for joining us. We have four very interesting papers today that really highlight structural factors that are found in New York or parts thereof that are just so important to the way we do politics, whether it's upstate or downstate, or Western New York, as some of our colleagues from the Western New York would like to say. So I enjoyed all the papers, and I'm looking forward to hearing your presentations. We're going to proceed based on order of the program. So we're going to hear from John Dan first on understanding the attitudes and norms of non-deviant cannabis users, what we need to know. We're going to next hear from Margaret Rourke on evaluating agency-based voter registration in New York City. Then we'll hear from Jeanette McKay called Remembering the Ladies regarding perceptions of local female political committee members on the recruitment of women for local elected office. And then we'll hear from Jeffrey Krause on New York City's public financing of political campaigns. Does the spending yield results? So with that, John, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Armand.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for the opportunity to present understanding the attitudes and norms of non-deviant cannabis users, what we know and what we need to know. Recreational cannabis became legal in New York State on March 21st, 2021, effectively ending almost 100 years of cannabis prohibition at the state level. This provides policymakers and researchers with a golden opportunity. Now we can create evidence-based cannabis policies focused on harm reduction that reflect behaviors and values of those who have normalized and legitimized cannabis use as a lifestyle choice, responsible cannabis users. While working with the town board of Lansing, New York to help them prepare for the decision to opt in or out of retail cannabis sales, I found a great deal of what seemed like counterintuitive data being collected in regard to legalization. Since cannabis was made a Schedule I narcotic by Congress and the Nixon administration in 1970, it stands to reason that cannabis is as dangerous as other Schedule I narcotics, such as cocaine and heroin. However, as more states legalize cannabis, the findings are far from frightening. For example, according to the assessment of the potential impact of regulated marijuana in New York State, which was published by the New York State Health Department, there has been no increase in violent crime or property crime rates around medical marijuana dispensaries that have opened in New York State. According to the Reason Foundation, there are four main results that come from recreational cannabis legalization. Users end up substituting marijuana for other more dangerous drugs, especially alcohol and opiates. Marijuana consumers substitute legal marijuana for illicit marijuana, taking money away from organized crime and drug cartels. There is a significant reduction in crimes associated with marijuana production, distribution, possession, and sales. And there is an overall reduction in crime, including property and violent crimes. In a study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, states that have legalized cannabis have seen changes in youth consumption that are statistically indistinguishable from zero. In certain areas, AMA researchers found that teen use actually lessened after legalization. This finding is supported by the AMA's sister journal, the Journal of the American Medical Association Pediatrics, which showed an 8% decline in teen use in states where adult use is legal. 3 years after the legalization of regulated marijuana in Colorado, according to a study cited in the New York State Impact Assessment, there were no significant increases in motor vehicle crash rates. Another study found that 3 years after legalization, the number of vehicle-related fatalities in Washington and Colorado were not statistically different from fatality rates in states that had not legalized cannabis. The CDC also completed a 10-year study in Arizona and found that legalized cannabis did not increase the risk of fatal car accidents even on cannabis-themed holidays, such as April 20th or 420. After 100 years of prohibition and misinformation, we are now being asked to allow something that we were taught as a society to forbid. This will require converting to a data-based understanding of cannabis, cannabis users, and the reality of cannabis use. It will also require effort, especially on the part of researchers and lawmakers, to better understand those most responsible for increasing society's acceptance of cannabis use. Learning what motivates responsible cannabis users will help New York State lawmakers to create an inviting regulated market and also give lawmakers the tools they need to create evidence-based harm reduction policies that work as well as the informal policies already being used by those we might call cannabis lifestyle ambassadors. My research proposal involves interviewing cannabis users who, outside of their cannabis use, would be considered mainstream citizens. It will bring to light the attitudes of these cannabis users toward cannabis, legalization, and regulation. This information can then be used to overcome the major obstacles that exist in creating a legal cannabis industry, the most important of which is convincing cannabis users to move from the illicit to the regulated market. It is not hyperbole to say that creating a legal cannabis industry that cannabis users won't participate in is a waste of time and money. And my research and my proposal would provide a necessary bridge between the motivations and behaviors of responsible cannabis users and the cannabis policies that lawmakers will be implementing. I also expect this research to shed light on the surprisingly positive data that is being collected across the country as legalization becomes more widespread. Questions to be answered through this research. How do cannabis users in Tompkins County, New York feel about the use, legalization, and regulation of cannabis? And number two, do they plan to take part in the regulated cannabis industry? Why or why not? Research design and methods. A non-random propulsive sampling method will be used to recruit individuals who represent a mainstream version of the cannabis user, defined as someone who has learned to incorporate cannabis use into their lives in a way that does not interfere with their professional, social, family, or financial obligations. Since legal cannabis can only be purchased by adults aged 21 and up, the study will only include those aged 21 and over. All participants will be current cannabis users, which will be defined as someone who has used cannabis at least twice a month for the past 12 months for non-medical purposes. Participants will have engaged in this behavior for at least the last 3 years. Subjects must be employed and or be enrolled as either undergraduate or graduate students at the time of the study. Subjects must have been living at the same residence for at least 6 months, unless they are students. By limiting the parameters of the study in this way, we will learn more about the motivations and values of Tompkins County residents whose cannabis use could be argued to be more of a lifestyle choice than a deviant behavior. Research subjects will be contacted using several methods. First, a Facebook advertisement will be created seeking out cannabis users in Tompkins County. Facebook allows for many targeting parameters, but not cannabis user. Thus, our outreach strategy will use targeting parameters that include behaviors often associated with cannabis use. Interest in pop culture icons, such as Bob Marley and Snoop Doggy Dogg, cannabis-related media, such as High Times, organizations, such as the Marijuana Policy Project, NORML, or Americans for Safe Access, and phrases such as vaping weed will be used as targeting parameters. Care will be taken to assure those contacted in this way that IP addresses are not being collected. Next, permission will be requested from head shops and other venues that sell cannabis-related paraphernalia to post flyers. Third, advertisements for the study will be taken out in local newspapers that have a higher likelihood of being noticed by cannabis users who rely on traditional media outlets. As test subjects are recruited, these participants will then be invited to solicit participation from other cannabis users in their social circles. Printed cards with project information, contact information, and ID numbers for anonymity will be given, along with a monetary incentive of $20 for each recruit. Given the social situation of the subjects, employed or enrolled in school with stable housing, this should not dramatically influence participation. To control for sampling bias, no more than 3 recruits will be allowed per subject. Once recruited, a short sociodemographic questionnaire will be filled out, and an initial interview will take place using 6 criteria. These will be: number 1, the role of cannabis in the respondents' lives; number 2, the contexts in which they use cannabis; number 3, what they deem to be appropriate and/or inappropriate consumption; number 4, any stigmatization experiences; number 5, the influence of cannabis laws and regulations, both formal and informal, and both before and after legalization; and number 6, ways in which they have modulated their cannabis use to avoid negative legal or social consequences. Interviews will be recorded. With these initial interviews, researchers will apply grounded theory analysis to find themes, and then develop questions from those themes that can be used in focus groups. The way focus groups will be determined will depend on the number and categories of respondents, but priority will be given to creating focus groups based on age and/or geographic living area, especially rural versus urban. A facilitator will guide the discussion, and depending on the size of the focus groups, the facilitator may also be joined by 1 or 2 co-facilitators. Notes and memos will be kept by facilitators, and group discussions will be recorded as well. Focus groups will continue until data saturation is achieved, which will be defined as no new information emerging from the conversation for a period of 4 to 5 minutes. Transcripts from the initial interviews and the focus groups will be analyzed and coded, looking for thematic patterns. Once coding and analysis have been completed, these thematic patterns can be combined with salient quotes from the interviews and focus groups for administrators and lawmakers to consider as they create cannabis policies. Research subjects who are willing to take part in a longitudinal study should be contacted again 2 years after retail distribution has been established in New York to determine if any new themes can be identified, using the same 6 criteria used to develop the initial interviews. It will then lead to a second round of focus groups. Concerns and strengths. Use of non-random purposive sampling will limit the generalizability of this study to those cannabis users that in some way identify with the research subjects. Depending on the number of respondents, multiple researchers well-versed in qualitative research design and grounded theory analysis will be needed to conduct interviews and facilitate focus groups, then organize and evaluate the data. Researchers will need to agree on thematic categories and have positive attitudes toward cannabis use in the newly formed cannabis industry. Personal interviews and focus groups would provide relevant information from different perspectives that accurately reflect the concerns and motivations of responsible cannabis users. Using a grounded theory approach encourages researchers not to use preconceived notions when developing thematic content from interview and focus group transcripts. The firsthand experiences and anecdotal evidence of non-deviant cannabis users would provide policymakers with richly detailed data to consider when developing policies focused on harm reduction strategies as opposed to prohibitionist strategies. While time-consuming, interviews and focus groups are not expensive and do not require large teams of researchers. Finally, this study is easily extended into the future, saving New York State time and money when the need for fresh data arises. Thank you for your time, and I will now be happy to try and answer any questions.
We'll take questions at the end.
Oh, sure. Sorry.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, John. Dr. Gork.
Hi, everybody.
Hello.
So my paper is about evaluating New York City's agency-based voter registration programs. I've previously written about the National Voter Registration Act, and agency-based registration is an important part of that federal law, which was established in 1995. It requires all covered states to include agency-based registration in the motor vehicle agency, public assistance agencies, and disability agencies. And New York, kind of inspired by that, created its own program in 2000, which now requires registration in 26 agencies. So I want to look at how effective this is and what we can learn from the program about what works well and what doesn't. So let me start with a little background on where this came from. In 2000, New York City passed a local, what's called pro-voter law, which required that 19 city agencies offer voter registration. It was modeled after the National Voter Registration Act. And the idea of this kind of agency-based registration is that you're taking advantage of an opportunity when a citizen contacts some government agency, not the Board of Elections, to register them to vote. So it's supposed to save somebody a trip and offer people more opportunities to register. In 2014, 5 nonprofit voter advocacy groups in New York City decided to assess New York's compliance with its law. And they produced a report called Broken Promises, Agency-Based Voter Registration in New York City. Through field investigations and Freedom of Information requests, the 5 organizations found that agencies were largely failing to properly implement the pro-voter law. Agencies were paying scattered and inconsistent attention to the law. A small survey of clients at 14 agencies found that 70% of the citizen respondents were not asked if they wanted to register to vote, and that 71% of those whose primary language was not English were not given a voter registration form in their preferred language, as is also required by the law. 11 agency staff, a small sample, were willing to answer questions about training, and they all reported that they got no regular training on voter registration. There were 2 good outcomes of this report. One is that the mayor at that time produced a mayoral directive requiring compliance with the law and semi-annual reporting, which had never been required before. It also led to the city council passing a new version of the pro-voter law, which added 7 agencies to the agencies required to participate. It clarified that voter registration applications had to be available in the same language as the agency's own applications. New York City requires many public applications to be available in a number of languages. It required agencies to offer the same assistance with the voter registration form as they do with their own form. It required them to physically incorporate the voter registration form into their agency application. And it required them to code the forms in a way that it would allow the Board of Elections to report on how many forms from the agencies had gotten back to the board. So these have all been in effect since 2015, but they have not been evaluated. The whole point of having them report was that somebody could pay attention to the numbers, but I don't think anybody's paying any attention to the numbers. And hence this study. A little bit on how I decided to do this. It became a lot easier. It was very hard for the groups in 2014 to evaluate whether or not registration was happening and how much was happening. It's become somewhat simpler. The semi-annual reporting that agencies do has them say how many forms they've distributed, how many they collected and submitted to the BOE themselves, how many clicks they got on their website to their voter information, how many staff they trained, and to produce some narrative information on their activities. There's a couple of challenges with this. One is that the agencies are very different in size and in how many interactions they have with the public. Lots of people go to HRA to apply for food stamps or Medicaid or TANF, but not so many people go to the Business Integrity Commission to report on organized crime at the waterfront. So figuring out how much we should expect them to do is hard. Also, pandemic restrictions have made it challenging to field test the agency's practices, and kind of gives them an out if they say they're not doing what they should be. It's a little hard to say what they. I forgot to set my timer at the beginning. How am I doing time-wise?
You're on almost 6 minutes, so you're good.
Great. Okay, good.
A little more than that.
So a little bit about what we know about agency-based registration from the national research on the NVRA and other similar programs. It was used in the United States as early as 1975 when the Motor Vehicle Bureau in Michigan started using it. Research, most notably by Stephen Knack, has shown that active voter registration is much more effective than passive. Active is you come in and apply and I say, and would you like to register to vote today? Passive is there are forms in the waiting room if you want to take them. By 1985, 9 states were doing registration in motor vehicle bureaus. And in 1993, the federal law, the Motor Voter Act, required active, physically integrated into the application registration in the DMV, and active, but not that integrated in public assistance and disability agencies. We've learned from research that I and others have done on the implementation of the NVRA that implementation is far from uniform. It appears to be influenced by politics, by agency priorities, by inertia. And we notice also that even in agencies where registration is offered fairly consistently, registration numbers go up in election years because more people pay attention to the invitation at that time. So let me show you on some slides. Oops. Oops. I think I don't have the setup right to show you. Maybe I'll just have to talk about it. So in the paper, I have reported on the distribution of applications sent out and applications submitted. If we look at applications over time from 2015 to 2020, I divided, there's 26 agencies. One is HRA, which is the big public assistance agency in New York City. And it's been required to do voter registration since 1995. And even though the feds didn't require them to do this, in New York, they did integrate the application into their own application. So they're doing kind of like the closest to the gold standard of any of these organizations. So in my tables, in my charts, I separated them out. We see larger numbers in HRA, although an extremely big drop off after 2018. 2018 was like a peak of the distribution of applications. And this could be, a post-election dip followed by the pandemic. It could be more than that. It could be a change in policy at the agency. I need to explore that further. The other agencies have not distributed anywhere near the number of applications that HRA has, and they've fallen off over time. And I think what's happening here is there was some attention to the issue in 2015 as it was new, and there's been no real focus on it since. So the incentive for agencies to work on it has not been great. If we look at applications submitted, we have 2 ways to do this, right? The HRA applications, we have 1 way, but for the other agencies, we can both look at the number they themselves report collecting from an individual person and turning into the BOE, which they do. But also the coded applications, like if an agency person hands someone an application at the Parks Department that is coded 9. And if that person fills it out and turns it back in, the BOE should be able to recognize that as a form that went through the agency system. They won't know that it's necessarily the Parks Department, but they'll know that it came through an agency. There's a little bit of fuzziness about this because I'm given to understand by people who work on this that the Board of Elections might not take note of every application that's coded 9, but it's a better number. So my chart, which again, I'm sorry, I can't show you, Michael's the only one who's seen it, shows that we had kind of like a big start with in the like 20,000 range of all the 25 agencies having almost 20,000 coded 9 applications. So we saw that there were many applications that weren't reported submitted by the agency, but that did get back to the agency from there. And this has fallen over time. Both the number that the agencies report and the code 9 number have fallen very significantly over time. And HRA also much more troubling since HRA is required by federal law and should be much more consistent because it's a part of the application. I also looked at their web presence. Every agency should have, this is not in the law, but it's encouraged by the mayor's office, that they use one of 2 websites that are offered by the city that give you a chance to register, to find out when the election is, to find out who the candidates are. Almost every agency has had a link on their website almost every year. There are 5 that didn't. There's a wide variety in the number of clicks they get on those. Some of that is the positioning of the web presence. And so that's a thing that they can work on. And then some, of course, is the traffic to their own site. I want to talk a little bit about what we know about the methods being used by the agencies. The only one, and I think I said this before, is the gold standard is HRA. The only one that's actually doing truly active integrated registration when they're doing the best they can do is HRA. There are 6 other agencies that appear to be doing actually active registration. They're actually asking people, do you want to register to vote, or including it in the application? But none of those have it integrated into their application, which all the agencies are required to do. And the 6 additional agencies only do that with sort of targeted populations. I'll give you one example. The Department of Cultural Affairs, which is a big agency in New York City that does a lot of things, only does active registration at their Materials for the Arts warehouse in Queens, where artists and teachers can go 9 days a month and pick up free materials to do art things. So the artists and teachers who go to that warehouse, which is a relatively tiny percentage of people, get asked, but other people that they might be in touch with don't. 5 agencies mail out the registration form with other materials. So if you apply for a senior citizen,
1 minute left.
Okay, you'll get others. About half make use of events and workshops, and almost all of them make the forms passively available in waiting rooms. But as I said before, this is close to useless. I'm working on trying to identify the factors that tell us what's different. The number of public contacts is obviously important. The practicality of registering their contacts, right? We don't expect the fire department to offer registration at the scene of a fire. Some agencies have been more creative than others in thinking about different groups they can reach, job applicants, for example. The strategy used by the agency, which I've talked about, and their commitment to the goal. And I guess I should add to this, whether or not they feel a real message from the city administration more broadly that they should be doing this and feel committed to do it. So those are the factors I'm looking at as I try to understand what's going on and see what we can come up with as best practices. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. McKay.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Okay, so this is my research. It's remembering the ladies in the secret garden. What I did is I wanted to take a look at female underrepresentation and see if there was any causal link or something that we could identify to look at further with how local political committees recruit women from the lens of women political committee members. So, and I wanted to see if there was a barrier to entry. So female underrepresentation is not unique to New York State or certainly the US. We see that there's a dearth of women in heads of government on the world stage. We see it in Congress where women are at like the 27% range. We see it in the gubernatorial side of the US and state legislatures where women are about 30%. And governors at only 9 out of the 50. We see it in the New York State legislature with women at 34%, even though women have statistically a decent edge on men and population. And we certainly see it in what I'll call upper house or the upper house areas of the Senate, US state legislatures throughout the country and in New York State. So you might be thinking, okay, what does that have to do with local political recruitment? So this is where the literature comes in. And the local elected office has been found in the literature to be the stepping stone to higher elected office, right? And certainly from a common sense perspective, in order to have more women elected, you need more women to run for office, right? They need to be recruited to run. And since candidate recruitment, certainly by the bylaws of local political committees, as well as through the literature, is a major focus of local political committees and what candidates, both men and women, identify as a key component to their decision to run, I thought it would be very interesting to look at local political party committee involvement in the recruitment of women, especially because there was not a significant amount of research in that area because it's cumbersome. So my research context was the 9th Judicial District in New York State that encompasses the 5 counties of the Lower Hudson Valley. I chose that because it's diverse, not just in ethnicity, but in finance, in cities, suburbs, rural areas. There's a fair amount of people, and the men to women breakdown is similar to the country. So how did I do this? I did a descriptive feminological study. So I took what I was trying to do is when I knew I was going to speak to female committee members, political committee members, I also wanted to see what the on the ground realities were, so that if I could see if it was, if what I was hearing from the women was reflected in some sort of municipal data. So the municipal data I looked at is I looked at the 5 counties, their leadership, and I looked at the 17 municipalities that were involved with my female participants. I looked at the demographic data of my interviewees, and as well as the demographic data of the committees as reported by those interviewees. I interviewed 25 female political committee members. They represent collectively 20 committees in the 9 judicial districts. They represent 17 municipalities and across the 5 counties in the 9th judicial district. So clearly I had some women some committees that were represented twice. And across the municipalities, I had various political groups affiliations. So this is the summary of my findings, and it's really a summary. So basically, I did find that there was significant female underrepresentation in the lower Hudson, in the 9th Judicial District, on both the county, the legislative, and in 16 of the 17 municipalities that I looked at through the descriptive data. When I looked at the county exec history, the counties came onto the county exec model at different times, starting in 1938. Of those 29 executives that had across the 5 counties, only 3 were women. That of all the county legislators, there are 91 in total across the 5 counties, 24 are women. And one of those counties are an outlier. They have a fair amount of women. If I pull that county out, that the number for the other 4 counties is reduced to 18%. On 5 of the 17 municipal boards, meaning a town board, a village board, some of the smaller city councils, there were no female representation at all. And one of the 17 boards did have a female in a leadership role, but in 16 of them, it was all male. There was one board that did have a person of color in their leadership role. It was not a woman, and I'll explain in a minute why I spoke about when I go into the other data, where I can talk about the influence of people of color. The female candidacy rate. So what happened then is when I looked at all of this, I said, okay, but I'm really looking at candidacy, women being recruited for candidates, not necessarily if they won, because that could be a different study, right? So I looked at, because I thought to myself, well, maybe the women are running, but they're not winning. And that would be something else. But when I looked at the candidacy rates for the 17 municipalities, and I looked at 3 years, I looked at 2015, 2017, and 2019. The candidacy rates for women across those 17 municipalities were only 20%. So only 20% of the total people that ran for local office were women. And if you looked at the leadership, meaning the mayor, the president, the supervisor of the town, if you looked at that, women, there were only 4 women across those 3 years that ran for those spots, in those 17 municipalities. So there were 56 chances, right, for them to, I think it's 56. Yeah, I think it's, my math might be off. But there were a fair amount of chances for women to run for leadership role, and only 4 ran. I did find that if you have a higher female population in the community, that might be an indicator for a more diverse board. I'd have to do additional research. I also found that the median household income didn't necessarily create a definitive indicator of a diverse board, whether it be racial or gender. But I did find something interesting that might warrant additional research, and that was my highest median income board and my lowest median income board. Those 2 boards ended up being the most diverse. So I just found that interesting. It was outside my study, but I did make a note of it for someone that might want to do that in the future. Okay, how come this isn't moving? There we go. Okay, so now I'm looking at my committees, because there is in the literature a supposition made that if more women are in positions of leadership, or they're more involved in committee activity, that maybe more women will be recruited for political office. I did not find that. I actually found the opposite. The participants of my study reported high number of women on committees, and I researched that as well. And they also reported that many of them themselves had been committee chairs and had served on the county committees, that the majority of participants said that they had previously been a candidate, that they had served on the committee for many years. They had served on committee leadership. They had served on the county committee leadership. They did list their motivation to join the committee as issue driven. So that was interesting. Environmental issues was one that came up. It might be a way to recruit people to join committees. And they listed often what they were members of the public sector. They cited laws, their profession. Often they were married and had children. 8 of my participants volunteered that they were women of diversity. I did not ask that question. What my final question during my interview was, is there anything else you'd like to tell me? And 8 of my participants then opened up themselves and shared significant their stories of what they had done as members of the committee and as candidates, and some of their information was, it was striking. So in the end, these are my research questions. I did find that recruitment is significantly gendered. There is some gender neutral activity, that there's an intersectionality of gendered recruitment and misogyny. Those were my participants' words. Racism, again, my participants' words, and ageism. I found that very interesting as well. There was ageism reported by my participants. That the barriers to recruitment for some women create what I called an intersectionality barricade that became too difficult for some women to overcome and run for office. My next question had to do with the committees. There's a lot of problems with political committees on the local level. They're weak, they require more training, they need more members, they need to so that they can support the candidates. They need to increase successful recruitment. They need more funds. But the reality is that the committees overall, their dedication to the political process, their civic mindedness, their vision oriented for these unpaid essentially volunteers, was consistent across the line. I did hear some reports of misogyny, their words, racism, their words, and ageism on some of the committees and in the committee leadership, but that was not as strong as the need for training and strengthening of the committees. I did have my phenomenological data that reports the quotes and other information about what my respondents reported. Started to create this emerging theory, which I'm continuing to explore, that collectively may be a barrier to recruitment for women. And I dubbed it, for lack of a better term, gendered recruitment theory, where there are 4 areas: affirmative recruitment, sorority recruitment, Madonna recruitment, and negative recruitment. I'm in the process of trying to identify a location so that I can see if this shows up in another area. Affirmative recruitment is that gender neutral activities that some of the my respondents stated happened, and there was gender blind. Sorority recruitment was interesting. It was the gendered reaction between potential female candidates and female recruiters, which was often empathetic, protective, but it absolutely was gendered, and sometimes was reported to, because it was too empathetic and too protective, a woman decided not to run because she heard the negatives of how this could affect her family and that kind of thing. So it was almost like a protective nature. It was very interesting. I then had something called, that I dubbed Madonna recruitment, which was similar, except that this comes from males, that it was again biased, but not misogynistic in nature, that they almost saw, and I saw this was reported in, like, say, the last 5 to 6 years that they've seen in recruitment, where men say, well, literally, we need to get a woman to run for this race, and we need a woman who's young with kids and works, and so it was almost like a glorification of a perception of femininity. So that was kind of interesting. Negative recruitment is just described as adverse, misogynistic, racist, or ageist. as reported by my respondents. And with that, thank you. And I appreciate being part of this panel and sharing my research with you all.
Thank you very much. Okay. Dr. Kraus.
Thank you. If I could share my screen. This is, of course, always fun. Right, there we go. This paper reviews the 30 years plus of the public finance program in New York City. In the paper, I go into the background of the program, the pressure that built for creating such a program in the mid-'80s, which was due to a couple of things. One, the increased spending on political campaigns. In 1985, the last citywide election, where there was no public financing, Mayor Koch, who didn't face any opposition. In fact, he was the candidate of both the Democratic and Republican parties in that election. But nonetheless, he spent $6.3 million. City Council President Andrew Stein spent $3 million. Comptroller Harrison Golden spent $1.3 million. These were the three citywide offices. Only Stein had any significant opposition in the general election. But nonetheless, there was significant spending for the citywide offices. There was concern, and this was raised by State Senator Franz Leitner, who represented the district in Upper Manhattan, that many of the contributors to the citywide campaigns and also to the 5 borough presidents were individuals that had business before the City Board of Estimate. Board of Estimate was at one point a second governance body in the city of New York, which, among other things, played a role in the awarding of contracts, land use, the budget. And Leitner found in a study that he did that a significant number of contributors, especially large contributors, had business pending before the Board of Estimate at some point in time. And there was also a desire to create the program after 1985, during Mayor Koch's third term, when there were a number of scandals that raised concerns about the influence of money in politics. So a proposal was made in the City Council in 1986 for a program. It didn't get anywhere. Legislation was again introduced, and in 1988, it was enacted, and it took effect for the 1989 citywide elections. And it had a number of goals. One was to impose contribution limits. Now, there were contribution limits already in place under the New York State election law, but they were significantly higher than those that were enshrined in this act. There would also be expenditure limits. Candidates who agreed to participate in this program would agree to limit their campaign expenditures. In doing so, if they met certain thresholds in terms of the raising of small contributions, they would be eligible for public finance matching funds. Initially, that was a 1-to-1 match, except where candidates were competing against a non-participating candidate, because that's an important point to raise about this program. Like most of these programs that are in place around the country, there are about 30, is that they're not mandatory. So initially, there was a 1-to-1 match and a 2-to-1 match for those individuals who were competing against non-participants. And at the outset, there were a significant number of non-participants. Of course, another goal of the act was increased competition. One of the presumptions was that many people might seek elective office if only for the availability of financial support. And the legislation, by creating this public funds component, was intended to do that. Another goal was more information for voters through enhanced campaign finance reports. which required more detailed information than financial disclosures required by New York state law, and also voter education, mainly through debates for citywide elected officials. So that was, or were the goals of the legislation. Over time, and I'll show this in a moment. Okay, expenditure limits have been increased after each election. So if you look in 1989, and this covers right through the election in 2021, you can see the amounts. Initially for mayor was $3 million, now increased for the last election to 7.2 million. You see for controller and public advocate, the other two citywide offices, the amounts, the limits on borough president candidates and city council. By the way, if you look at city council, initially those limits were very low. They started at 60,000. And after the first election cycle, when a number of candidates complained that that was too small an amount to run a viable campaign, that was kicked up to 105,000 for the next cycle. That's the most significant increase over the years. And after each cycle, the amount has been increased, mainly based on the consumer price index. Okay, but the idea here was that individuals, if they joined the program, agreed to these expenditure limits. And I would note those are per election. So it's for the primary and for the general election until 2017, at least in the case of these three citywide offices, that also included a runoff election. Under the law, until the end, actually it started in 1973 and continued through 2017. If no citywide candidate received 40% in the primary, there would be a runoff primary between the top two finishers. And under this act, an additional, in the case of, let's say, the mayor in 1997, an additional 4.7 million could be raised and spent. After 2017, for the primaries, for the citywide primaries, there was a change made. New York City has gone in primaries to ranked choice voting, which is used in some jurisdictions. So that, of course, eliminates the need for a runoff primary. But nonetheless, these were the expenditure limits that were put in place and have been increased over the years as the prices that we all deal with go up. Okay, so you had expenditure limits. You also, of course, the hope here was, and I just have, this was a statement out of the Campaign Finance Board's first program or first annual report, where they indicated to restrict the influence on electoral campaigns, they set limits on contributions, expenditures, and strict requirements on financial disclosure. The basic premise is stated, and this is still the goal of the program, to level the playing field, the presumption being that by creating a public finance program, okay, it would allow individuals who might not necessarily have access to funds the opportunity to compete in the election. That, of course, was one of the other goals, by the way, that there'd be an increase in competition. And the one thing I want to say about that before I get into the expenditures is it's been very interesting. The most recent election had the highest number of participating candidates, as you can see on the slide that I have up here. In 2021, there were 262 candidates for city council who participated in the program. And that, of course, started back in 1989 with 33. And if you notice over the years, there have been points where it's increased and points where it's decreased. And this relates to the notion that the program would lead to increased competition. It has to some degree, but much of that competition in each election cycle takes place where there are open seats. In other words, where there is no incumbent seeking re-election. Now, New York in the 90s introduced term limits. And that, of course, has ensured that council seats, and for that matter, the borough presidencies and the 3 citywide positions are open on a somewhat regular basis. You might know that after the 2005 election, Mayor Bloomberg, who would have been term limited, was able to convince the city council to modify the law to provide for individuals who were serving not only in citywide positions, but in the borough presidencies and in the city council to run not just for 2 terms, but for a 3rd term. As you might expect, there wasn't too much opposition to that. That allowed for Mr. Bloomberg to run for a 3rd term in 2009. In fact, many of his other colleagues in government. So if you look at 2009, there were 170 candidates. But then 2013, 126, 2017, when there weren't that many open seats, 96, and 2021, when there were a significant number of open seats, 262 candidates. So the notion that public funds leads to increased participation, well, there seems to be one caveat, and that is the availability of open seats. A number of city council incumbents have not faced, and I look mainly at Democratic primaries because that's where most of the competition in the city of New York is. In many instances, Democratic incumbents do not have any opposition. In some cases, they may have 1 or 2 opponents. But if you look at open seats, especially if you look at the last election, there were city council primaries that had as many as a dozen candidates on the ballot, mainly in areas where there were open seats. Okay, so while yes, the legislation was intended to encourage competition, and it certainly has, the caveat there is it tends to be limited to where there are a number of open seats. And because of term limits, there are open seats on a fairly regular basis. In this chart here, I show you expenditures for the council. Okay, and this is for participating candidates, and you can see the total expenditures and the average expenditures. And there's been an increase there, as you can see, from 83,000 in 1989 to 187,000 in the last election. And it's gone up fairly consistently, in part because not only the increase in the spending limit, but also I just want to mention the increase in matching funds. As I said before, the program initially started out as a 1-to-1 match. Over the years, and much of this took place during Michael Bloomberg's mayoralty, that match continued to increase. In fact, for the 2021 election, the match was 8-to-1. For every eligible dollar that candidates raised, which basically was from contributions from city residents of $175 or less, they would receive $8 in public funds. Okay, so there has been an increase, especially in council election spending, largely due to the availability of public funds. You know, candidates are able to access this money, and therefore they spend this money. Okay, if you look at total funds available to candidates, you can see that there's been an interesting change over the years in where the ratio of private to public funds is flipped. Initially, and this goes back, of course, to the 1-to-1 match, much of the money raised or by candidates or used by candidates was privately raised. Okay. Over the years, as the match increased, you can see that the numbers started changing. So you went from what really was a 5-to-1 private to public funds ratio to a 2-to-1. And then, of course, if you notice in the last election, you had, for the first time, more public funds spent on city council campaigns than private funds. And we're talking here by 2.5% margin.
Just one more minute, please, Dr. Krause.
Okay. So, you know, it's a very significant change. You move from a 1-to-1 match in 1989 then during the early 2000s to a 2-to-1, 3-to-1, 4-to-1 match, and then for 2021, an 8-to-1 match. Okay, so you see a greater reliance on public funds. Also, I would note that during this time, there were a couple of other changes related to contributions. In the late 90s, corporate contributions were outlawed. Subsequently, that prohibition was extended to LLCs, limited liability corporations. Also, a change in the law that was made was that individuals who do business with the city, the amounts they can contribute are sharply limited, and those will not be matched. Okay, so there have been some changes along the way in terms of who can contribute, how much can be contributed, and how much that will be matched. Okay. Of course, there are those who don't participate. And one of the things that we've seen over the years is that a number of non-participants have been elected to the city council. You know, the interesting thing, in 1989, when the council still had 35 members, 26 of those elected did not participate in the program. 1991, the council was expanded to 51. That was at the time that the Board of Estimate was done away with. But you could see over the years, there were a significant number of non-participants elected. In 2021, the last election, only 3 were elected. Okay, but throughout the years, a significant number. In fact, in 2017, had a very significant development. For the first time, a council candidate spent over $1 million in a council race. Mark Gonage from the Bronx, and he was elected. He decided not to run for re-election in 2021. But the interesting thing, we've seen non-participants have considerable success. Obviously, one person who is not running for the council, but nonetheless a non-participant who had a significant impact on all of this was Michael Bloomberg. Mr. Bloomberg, in his 3 races, spent nearly $300 million of his own money to be elected mayor 3 times. Okay, well, you know, much beyond what his opponents in the general election, all of whom were participants in the public finance program, were able to spend. He outspent them, you know, on a ratio anywhere from 10 to 12 to 1 in his 3 elections. And that's frankly the greatest flaw one could argue in this program. A non-participant who's willing to spend unlimited sums of money, his own money or her own money, can certainly, you might say, undermine the process. And Mr. Bloomberg did do that. In the last election, there was a candidate for mayor on the Democratic side who also chose not to participate in the program, which allowed him to raise more money from individuals using the limits under state law. But in the end, he didn't do very well. Okay, but nonetheless, non-participants always, you might say, potentially are a threat to this system. Okay. If we look at some of the other goals of this act, you know, the hope was that increased public education through the availability of enhanced campaign finance disclosure. I don't think the public has been all that concerned about that. And even debates, which are required by participants for the citywide elected offices. Their television ratings, frankly, are not very high. Not too many New Yorkers are watching those things. And it might just have more to do with the fact that, you know, they're perhaps obtaining their information through other means, where at the last few elections have not been all that competitive. Okay, but nonetheless, the program has been significant, one could argue, because it has created this opportunity in terms of public funding. Certainly in districts that are open, it's created more competition. And you know, the other thing you could say, you know, I say cynically, it certainly created a lot of opportunities for political consultants, shopping bag producers, and you know, printing companies as well as through the post office. Okay, what is my conclusion in all this? Obviously, more candidates than ever before participated in 2021. Campaign spending in citywide elections has slowed. City council campaign spending has increased significantly over the years, in large part due to the availability of public funds. Historically, there wasn't much spending on city council campaigns in the pre-public finance era. Why? The money was spent on either the citywide races or the borough-wide races because of the Board of Estimate. That seems to be one of the major reasons. So the elimination of the board, many of the powers once held by the board now belong to the council. But even with that, until public finance became an important component in terms of their fundraising, a lot of candidates didn't really spend a lot of money. As far as competition, it's impacted more by the availability of open seats, and those have increased through the introduction of term limits, and non-competing, non-participating candidates can undermine the system. We can call that the Bloomberg effect. Obviously, it's impacted in history elections. It's also impacted in a number of council elections over the years, going back to the 1990s, when Andrew Aristoff, who was not in public finance, spent quite a bit of his own money as well as his family's money, his heir to the Phipps fortune, to get elected to the council. In fact, in a special election, he won by about 57 votes, and then did a little bit better in the general.
Dr. Cross, I hate to cut you off. Someone has to leave at 2:30. Is that okay?
Okay, so in that case, all I could say is it's a program that certainly has had a significant impact on local elections in New York City, especially in terms of competition where there aren't any incumbents. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr.
Okay.
You're muted.
Oh, okay.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Jeanette. Okay, so John has to leave at 2:30, so I want to get my comments into John, and then if anyone has any questions, by all means, please ask them. So I very much appreciate that you're interested in policy impact, in part on a particular group who are very affected by a new policy that we don't really understand the impacts of yet. I appreciate that very well. And I appreciate that you're trying to help us all muddle through the new policy frontier. And we don't understand the impact of this policy yet. So I very much appreciate that. Two things. One, you're going to need to explain why Tompkins County. What's so special about Tompkins County in your study regarding why that's where you're going to be doing this analysis. The second thing is with your recruitment efforts, I would drop any references to popular culture figures in your Facebook ads. One, I don't think they're relevant. Two, I think it will harm the study. So that's my strong recommendation going forward for those two things. And that'll harm the study for a number of reasons. So does anyone have any questions for John? Because John has to go. And I promised he would be able to leave at 9:30. So anyone have any questions for John? And do you have any comments based on those questions, those statements, John?
Sure, thank you. So the Tompkins County, originally when I wrote the research proposal, it was for a professor who wanted me to focus locally, and I live in Tompkins County. The only reason I would want it was really more of a just a way of saying a certain population. I wouldn't want to limit it to Tompkins County, but breaking it down by counties seemed like it was so convenient. So I just kept the Tompkins County part of the research proposal when I expanded it. But yeah, I could certainly scratch it. And as far as the public, the figures go, yeah, I could definitely drop those. If you think they'd be harmful, I could definitely drop that.
I think it'll be, I look forward to seeing the results of everything.
Thank you.
So thank you. We wanted to get you out of here on time because, you know, daddy
I
duty is
appreciate it.
important. So
Yeah, thank you.
thank you. Okay, so I'll continue on. So I'll give all my comments and all the papers now together, and then we'll open it up to questions after that for everybody. Is that okay with everyone? Okay, Margaret's paper. I enjoyed the paper. This is a highly readable paper. It's an interesting topic about something that is important on the city level and on the state level. So this doesn't just have New York City impact. You know, New York City elections impact stuff statewide. And I wish people paid more attention to this because this really shows that agency matters. Not just the agency, it's just agency in general. And that's what I really enjoyed about this. So these are a couple of questions. Just to be clear, community boards, NYSPSA, and the city clerk are not mandated to participate in this. That's amazing to me, especially NYSPSA and the city clerk. Community boards, I think they have more access, or I'd like to think they have more access than a lot of these agencies. And my, were corrections and the CCRB busy giving out things. That was the other thing. I'm like, what is going on there? But not probation, but those two are. So I was like, wow, especially the CCRB. I mean, I'm unbelievable. So here's some things. More of a literature review would be useful to the paper. Do you, and this is a question. I think you're muted. So if you want to, because if you want to answer some of these, do you know how many of these are new registrations versus re-registrations? Because that might be, I don't know if you could find that from the data, but that would be interesting, particularly with some of the agencies, whether those are, whether those are brand new voters or not. Because I'm assuming the stuff from the youth department's going to be, youth and community development might be brand new voters. I'm just assuming that. I don't know that. And other ones might not be. But that would be interesting, I think. So any information on that?
I haven't seen anything that would let me know that yet. I mean, it's a great question that I could try to, getting information out of the Board of Elections is like.
Oh, I understand.
Yeah. So, but like I know that gets reported to the Election Assistance Commission nationally for all of New York State's registration, but I don't know if the New York City Board of Elections could break that down for these agencies.
So just something to think about. If it's not possible, it's not possible. On page 2, could you just clarify who conducted the small study? You mentioned a small study. If you could just clarify that, that would be useful. For the table on total web clicks, if you could just clarify it's total web clicks on the voter registration links. That would be, because I was like, no, this can't be right that they've only had that 13 web clicks. So if you could just, then I went back and read everything. But if you could just do that, that would be great. The other thing I think is useful is on the table regarding how many got mailed to the Board of Elections versus how many were distributed. If you could put a percentage there, that would be interesting, because Fire only mailed in 100 and distributed 153, but they had like a 30% mail-in rate, so people were filling those out. So I think that would just be interesting to see how much each agency, how many voters they got percentage-wise versus how many would
Percentage of what?
So let me just double. Some of that percentage of some of applications sent to the Board of Agency as opposed to the sum of applications distributed.
Oh, yeah.
I think that would just be interesting because I was like, wow, aging has a pretty high number proportionally, and so does did Fire, but finance doesn't. So it would just, I don't know why, it would just be interesting.
Yeah.
I thought, but I very much enjoyed the paper. So very good. So okay. Jeanette McCoy-McKay's paper. I'm currently doing a qualitative study on the Hudson Valley. So you may find a citation in my book should it ever come out, because I studied the exact same area and then I went up to Albany. So wonderful on that. I appreciate that you found and spoke to county committee members, and I appreciate that you found 119 email addresses, because that was not that was not the easiest thing for me to go. It makes sense to go this route with recruitment because of the impact they have on nominations, and I understand what it's like driving around the Hudson Valley speaking to political activists. So,
Well, it's interesting because I was in COVID, so it was all done via Zoom. So
okay,
I saved mileage on my
okay, yes, I drove up and down the Taconic a bunch, but it was good. I appreciate well done. I understand, and this is difficult research, so I appreciate
Yep,
that.
yep.
I also appreciate the theoretical frames you used.
Oh, right. I didn't talk about that. So I did feminist institutional theory.
I thought that was all excellent. So if you want to turn this into a book, if you want to get published, I would say you would need more interviews, obviously. For this
Right.
application, it was totally fine. I understand, I can understand the difficulty of how it was hard to get Republican county committee members versus Democratic county committee members. I use snowball samples too, and at one point I had to just tell people, I'm sorry, I don't have enough time for this. So I don't know if you had that or not, or I just have too many people from this one county or what have you. I'm just wondering if you looked at some women's party clubs as opposed to just county committee members, because, and I don't know if there's an overlap there or not, because there are some active women clubs affiliated with the party, like a women's
Right.
club.
I mean, I think if I do this broader, I certainly would do that. So this was my dissertation paper, so I was trying to keep it narrow. And I also was trying to get it done. I mean, I actually had to, I had to fight to actually do a descriptive feminological. I wanted to do a mixed methods, and they were like, no, why don't you do a descriptive? And then that's why I didn't do the clubs. But I think if I broaden it, I absolutely would include that. I also think I would, certainly the League of Women Voters Up by Us is strong. It's nonpartisan. That might be interesting to see how they work on how they do that, and some other stuff like that.
Yes, I agree. I think that would be interesting. What did you look at county committee fill rates? Just curiously, because there's two per ED generally speaking outside.
Correct.
So I was just wondering, did any of these county committee members have to run the primary? Everything. I don't know if you were there for the Rockland County Committee fights or not. Is Rockland in your? Is Rockland? I can't remember. Is Rockland?
Rockland is in there. Yes. So it's
Okay.
it's Orange. It's Orange, Putnam, Rockland, Westchester, and Dutchess.
Right. So they just had loads of fun in Rockland.
Correct.
So I would be interesting to see.
And even in Orange, not this time around, we don't have it. I'm from Orange County, so Orange County doesn't have any this time around, and I don't think the Republicans had it last time. But previously in the city of Newburgh, the town of Newburgh, they were primary to get committee seats. Correct.
Right. And the one thing, and this sort of relates to the whole. This relates to previous two comments. When I was doing interviews in these very same areas, a lot of the subjects I interviewed didn't want to be on committees. They just want to work on campaign work. And some people, and some of yours too, they said, no, I've done this. I had to get a petition. I had to get on a petition to do this. This is not what I want to do. So I'm just wondering if there's other individuals you can talk about who are
right. So it would be a different study. It would be broader as to how to recruit women, because I was looking at the political committee members themselves and what they did. So I limited it. That was who my universe was. But you're right. If I wanted to look at the broader issue, is why aren't women running in this area, or I could look to the political elites that are not necessarily associated with the committees, and see how they recruit. And I think a lot of that would stem from the prior electeds and people who are elected in office now, but not on the committee. And they are, they're the mover and shakers, at least in this area.
So this is very enjoyable. And
great. Thank you so much.
More on it.
Well, I'm going to add, I'll send you when I do. I'm in the process of adding 2021 to my data, because I have 2015, 2017, 2019. So I'm in the process of adding 2021 to my data and looking for a suitable location to check on the theory.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
Okay, Dr. Krause, I could never present 30 years of data, actually, excuse me, more than that, 37 years of data in that organized and effective of a manner. So that is quite a feat, even for you, Dr. Krause. I think that is quite a feat to be able to give me a 30-page paper with all that information presented that well. You addressed important issues by the program and the law. I mean, that's the bottom line. You hit at what are the major issues, good and bad, with this, and it wasn't as though you were unfairly criticizing individuals. You had backup and reason why. The quote from Charles Barron, which you didn't talk about, was quite amazing about all the contractual obligations that city council and other city candidates have to landlords and so on and so forth. So that was and that's all true. That's all true. And it was an enjoyable paper to read. Just a couple of questions. When you were talking about the 1985 election, I think you said those numbers are from the general election only. I would just state that more clearly. I wasn't sure if that was, because didn't Koch have two primaries that year? Didn't he have a Republican primary and a Democratic primary? Which he clean clocked in both, I thought. But just clearly state that's from the general. You're muted, Dr. Krause.
Yeah, we've been doing this for over 2 years. I still can't get it right. But yeah, he did have primaries. There was, I do have those numbers. I should have included them. Although the interesting thing is he didn't spend that much in the primaries. He spent more in the general, which, defies comprehension, but in many ways that Koch defied comprehension. But that was, the last kind of, for lack of a better term, free spending election, until of course, Michael Bloomberg ran, and of course the free spending then was just one-sided in his three campaigns. Certainly I'll make note of that as I revise this, to do other things with it. Yeah, thanks.
One more question on page 6 and 7, and this, if two candidates are in the program and they're running against a third-party candidate not in the program, are they eligible for more matching funds?
Well, back then the answer was yes. One point I didn't get into in the presentation, which is in the paper somewhere, is that extra match, that 2-to-1 or whatever it became over the years, that was outlawed. That was changed in the early 2000 teens. Why? Because there was a Supreme Court case involving a similar program out of Arizona, which had a bonus, and the Supreme Court held that that bonus was unconstitutional. So Campaign Finance Board did away with that extra match for those facing non-participants. Before that time, if you're asking what was the case before that court decision, the answer is yes. If there was one non-participant in the race and two participants, or 3 or 4 or whatever, they would each be entitled to extra funds.
Okay, so I would just clarify that with the bonus, because that was my next question.
Okay.
On page 6. What did the bonus mean? Because at one point it's like, well, if they only send a certain amount of money, does that mean that's the bonus? So that's, so I would just clarify that, because
Okay.
and that could be different, that changes over time. But I and you talked about it later in the paper, but just right there, I was like, this is interesting stuff. And then finally on page 18, I would just be interested to know what is token opposition, and how do they figure out what token opposition is? Like you mentioned, Peter Vallone in 1997, and I looked it up. He ran against someone in the Right to Life Party. That's certainly token opposition.
Yeah.
But is a Democrat running on the South Shore, is that token opposition? You know what I mean? So stuff like that.
Well, if they qualify for matching funds, the answer is no. In the past couple of cycles, they have.
Mm-hmm. So
because the thresholds now are so low. But here you're mainly talking about third-party candidates.
Mm-hmm.
You have people, for example, who are competing in the Democratic primary that have already received, let's say, the Working Families Party endorsement, and they lose the Democratic primary, and they're still on the line, okay, because they can't be removed, after the primary. In New York, the only way, once petitions are filed or designations are filed, and we're seeing this now in case of the lieutenant governor, Okay, if an individual is on the ballot, the only way they can get off the ballot is to move out of state, be nominated for another office, or die. The third choice, I think, is not desirable for many candidates, but nonetheless, when we're talking about, in most cases, token opposition, we're talking about people who may have had one of those third-party lines was designated, was in a primary, usually Democratic primary, loses, and then can't get off that line. And usually, and more often than not, they don't bother to campaign anyway.
Thank you. That's all I've got for everybody. Does anyone have any questions for anyone else? We have 5 minutes left. We have 5 minutes left, 2:45. I believe the session is over.
Wow, we really used up our time.
We did. I enjoyed
We all
it.
talk long.
I enjoyed all the papers. Really good, and all the presentations. So if anyone has any questions, please let me know.
I just want to say, I think it's really interesting to look at the recruitment of female candidates. And, what I see, I live here in New York City, and what I see in local politics is a lot of dynastic politics, children of elected officials, and also just sort of like an informal pipeline of people who, like, it's understood it's their turn next. And I wonder, like, I don't know how you can pin that down in some way to be part of your study, but I think that's one of the obstacles that women face, is that men see this informal pipeline of that other guy who's part of it that needs to be next.
I think that's very true, and that came out in the feminological data. Because it's essentially a feminological study, and I use the descriptive data, but as an anchor to show the results on the ground. And I think, but that really came out in the feminological data that this lack of a pipeline in the sense of success breeds success, and lack of seeing that, at least on the local level, is problematic. But it's interesting, when I started my study, I had one idea of how it may be viewed, or its impact. But now, with an increasingly, as we're seeing across the country, things like that people are really understanding on some level, and it's not necessarily positive, in my opinion. That's an opinion statement, not an academic one, in the sense that, they're getting this, you're seeing some negativity around school boards and library boards and this local politics. And I just feel we need to get more strong people who think things through and to run for local office. And whether that's women or men, we just need to figure out ways to make that process easier for quality candidates. I looked at women because of the female underrepresentation, but I think there's something to be said across the board for getting quality candidates in the towns, and at least where I am, where this study was taken. But you're right. We see dynasty candidates all the time in this. I saw it when I was doing this study. Someone who ran in 2015, and then their brother, cousin, sister, ran in 6 years later. So you're right. But I think we have to figure out a way to get quality candidates at the local level, in my opinion.
One of the things that I think is harder outside of the city is that you have so many open positions, particularly during odd numbered years.
Correct.
You've got 51 council districts in New York City, borough presidents. But you've got, one town can have five or more, maybe 9 town board members.
Absolutely.
And then you've got all these weird positions, like,
And it's interesting, because what I did not, this could be a whole other study. What I didn't look at, and when I factored out, if you look at what I looked at the town boards. I didn't include the tax assessor, the highway superintendent, the clerk, because historically, I mean, this could be a whole different study. Historically, the highway supervisor is a guy and the town clerk, for whatever reason, is a woman. I mean, it could almost be, you know, a study of a vernacular or nomenclature as to why that is. And you know, you're right. It can be, you can be 9 or 10 people on a slate, seats open at the same time. It's also interesting. It's also interesting because it's an off election, which is a whole other can of worms. It's never, they're you know, they're the odd years. So it's not the state election. It's not the congressional election. It's not a presidential or gubernatorial election. It's on the off year, which also is another problem for recruitment of candidates and getting quality candidates on running for office, in my opinion.
Thank you, everybody. It is 2:45. Next session, I believe, starts at 3. So if there are any other final comments, now's the time. If not, I thank you all.
Thank you
Thank
for
you
reading
for
my
making this
study. I
happen.
appreciate it. Thank
Thank you.
you.
Thank you, Michael.
Welcome.
Take
Thank
care,
you.
everyone.
Be well. Thank you so much.